Good morning and welcome to Old St Andrews, Montrose for the sermon for Sunday the 1st of May, based on the passage from John chapter 21 verses 1 to 19. Jesus and Peter. Restored, not rewound. Sound familiar? It was only in February that we looked at Luke's account of the big catch of fish, which prompted Jesus' fishermen friends to become his followers. There it was very much the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it signalled the start of his disciples' journey with him. I've no problem with there being a reprise here. After all, it makes the strong connection for the disciples. The figure on the beach, different in appearance though he was their Lord and Master, the one who'd called them from their harvesting of the sea to their harvesting of souls for God's kingdom. It's meant to sound familiar. It's supposed to create a bridge from where the hard-nosed seafarers first made their bold response to Jesus' invitation to follow him, and where they were now, still somewhat shell-shocked, perturbed, confused. They had met with their risen Lord immediately after Easter. Things had moved at such a pace. It was exciting, exhilarating, if confusing. But there had followed a period of waiting, of doubt, of frustration. And Peter, the de facto leader, impetuous man though he was, and still with boats and water in his blood, decides that he is sitting it out no longer. He's going fishing. Why is it that we go back to the familiar, to the past, when things are tough, to real places that have been important to us in times past, or figuratively, reminiscing in memories, rereading books that meant a lot, or these days old box sets or films? Familiarity breeds contempt. We've heard the phrase. But actually many of us gain a tremendous amount of comfort from the familiar. Jesus needed to establish a connection between his friends' days of faith and trust and where they were now, beginning to wonder, to doubt, and to stray. Peter wasn't turning his back on Jesus and the kingdom. It wasn't a repeat denial, as his threefold denial of his master on the night of his arrest had been. But it was a stepping aside, to come to himself, to reflect, to get his head in order. Yet he was to discover that he couldn't sort himself out entirely by himself. It took Jesus' intervention. The fish, not the catch, but the command to let down his nets on the other side, and most of all the recognition that this really was the Master, risen with him again, the same Lord who had beckoned him from the shore of Lake Galilee years ago, who had invited him to share the wonderful journey of love and service, yes, and of strife and suffering too, and who would, as we're told at the end of the passage, lead to his death. Reunited. Bridge the gap. Jesus had to bridge the gap for Peter, make the connection for him between his early days of call and response, of faith and trust, over the emotional roller coaster of recent days, the ups and downs, the hallelujahs and celebrations of the grand entry into Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday, the poignant evening of the Last Supper, the dramatic arrest, the awful dark events of Calvary, and the devastating darkness of loss, not only of their Lord and Master, but of their own hope and faith. Then the gradual build-up of hope and joy, as initially in penny numbers, and then in groups, the believers met with the risen Jesus. And then a bit of frustration as Peter struggled to cope with the waiting. But eventually it was bridged for him. Jesus joins up the dots, or at least Peter is shown how Jesus has been there for him all along. Not in the way that he expected, not without suffering, not without the need for faith and of doubt, but they're just the same. Mind the gap isn't just a warning for those getting on and off trains. Maybe there's a need for us to heed it in the faith context too. For example, we can so easily jump from Palm Sunday to Easter Day, especially when many of us from a Presbyterian background don't make as much of Holy Week as some other denominations, and even less so since COVID. And I regret having to pull a service this year because I hadn't been well enough to do adequate preparation. It is what it is. But we do need a bridge from Palm Sunday to Easter that helps us to make sense of things, even if we're not down on the ground right in among it. We need a vantage point from above that gives us an insight into the upper room, the Garden of Gethsemane, the temple courtyards, the intrigue of Herod and Caiaphas, Jesus' suffering, and without doubt, the cross, his rejection, his burial, the sealed tomb. Because without that bridge, that insight, and at least some spark of connection to it, we can't possibly make sense of faith, hope, and resurrection. And personally, like Peter, we need help to bridge the gap between the events in Jerusalem and where each of us is in ourselves, our heads, our hearts now. Where and how are we to be touched by our risen Lord? Denial and restoration. 3 times Peter had denied Jesus on the night that he'd been arrested. People can be too hard on him, perhaps suggesting that as the leader of the disciples, he ought to have been brave enough to acknowledge Jesus and face the consequences. He had been brave enough to track Jesus into the temple courtyard, but it would have been foolhardy to openly acknowledge him. It would almost certainly have led to his own immediate arrest and execution. Jesus does not hold Peter's denial against him. He's more than ready to forgive him, and what's more, to restore him. And here in John's Gospel, we have the counterpoint of the threefold denial. We have the threefold affirmation of faith and commitment. 3 times Peter is asked if he loves Jesus. 3 times he replies in the affirmative, indeed getting a bit exasperated. But finally Jesus accepts it and says, "Feed my sheep." But it wasn't Jesus who needed to be convinced that Peter was genuine in his confession of faith. It was Peter. He needed the assurance from his master that his denial was behind him, that he was able to go forward in faith, knowing that whatever happened in the past, and no doubt regretting much of it, he was free to take up the reins and lead his friends to advance the cause of the kingdom of love. Restored, not rewound. Jesus restored Peter to fellowship, to faith, to future service. He didn't simply rewind the tape to the beginning and begin it again. I know that there's often talk of wiping the slate clean and so on, but God's way of dealing with our faults and failings embraces the reality. Just as Peter couldn't go back and undo his denial of Jesus, we can't undo the errors, the sins, the blunders, the hurts, and the damage we've done throughout our lives. Rather like scars from operations or accidents, we've to live with them. But God's forgiveness and restoration sets our faults and failings in a positive and forward-looking context. Peter's life wasn't rewound to before he denied Jesus and then restarted as though on a parallel life, akin to Back to the Future or something, and nor was he destined to repeat it over and over, akin to Groundhog Day. He had to accept the reality of his denial. In many ways it would live with him for the rest of his life. But because of Jesus' forgiveness and restoration, he was set free to live his life anew. For day to day he would be reminded of Jesus' love and acceptance, that in spite of his denial, he was being equipped to live out Jesus' love and to love and serve others for his Master's sake. Not because of any worth in himself, but freely through grace. The burden of his failings were lifted, even if they'd not disappeared. And so it can be for us. We don't need to pretend we're perfect, we're not. And while not glorying in our failings, we need to set them in context and act like the forgiven people that we are, delighting in the grace and love of Jesus, who's seen fit to accept us and restore us so that we can live positively for him and for others in the future. Together with him and with one another, we're to seek to build his reign of love, acceptance and forgiveness. Like Peter, we can't work it up in ourselves. We need Jesus' intervention and blessing. But as in the words of the hymn, past put behind us, for the future take us, Lord of our lives, to live for Christ alone. Yes, it might have looked like failure on Peter's part, giving up on the wait for Jesus, effectively put a sign up on the door, "Gone fishing." But in practice, he was looking to find his place in God's scheme of things. He was looking for Jesus, and Jesus found him, forgave him and restored him, and set him on the road of discipleship, which was going to lead many to faith and hope. And what of us? Can we not try it too? Not simply a wish to rewind to life as it used to be, but rather to a true restoration to life as God means it to be, in company with his Son, and for the glory of his kingdom of love. May the Lord bless you. Amen.